Welcome to Mountains Made Low, where we help our listeners to encounter the love of God and live well in the modern world. I am Christine Reagan.
And I'm Dennis Mueller. That went better.
You think so?
I do.
Oh my goodness. It's going to be our new normal.
Right.
You know, I'll do the intro, you do the outro. Who knows what'll happen.
Okay.
So we're going to tackle a tough topic today. So let's get all the laughing out of the way now, and
Right.
then we'll...
Yeah, this one's serious.
It is. So we want to address the reality of evil in the world today. And it's something that humanity has wrestled with since the beginning of time. And possibly more troubling than the reality of evil itself is the confusion that we can experience when we try to understand how a God who is perfectly good and loving, how he would allow evil to be a constant reality that we even have to encounter.
Yeah.
You know, why doesn't God do something about suffering, right? A question that I'm sure, if we're being honest with ourselves, we have asked time and time again. So this question can just be an enormous hurdle to us who are trying to live day after day in relationship to God. We want that relationship to be good, but then this question creeps in. And
Right.
I think it's valid. It's worth, you know, we're human, we deal with things, we have feelings. So we want to validate the emotions that come with that question and the asking of that question. What some people have experienced or are experiencing now is just a relentless encounter with evil and its effects. And that feels unbearable, or it may feel unbearable.
Yep.
Imagine adding to that the misunderstanding that God really isn't who he says he is, right? If that's what if I feel so alone, if this feels so painful, then God must not be real, or he must not be as good as he claims to be. So it's just anguish all around. And someone who's listening right now knows exactly what it is that I'm talking about.
Sometimes along those same lines, because we don't have answers and we're looking for answers.
Right, we're seeking.
And we're angry and we're upset. Sometimes the only recourse that we have is to blame God in our anger. Because we can't make sense if we don't have the answers, right? And that just compounds what we're already struggling with.
And what may even add to more agony is hearing maybe about the deliverance of somebody else from pain and suffering and not having that experience. And it might not be even that you want to take it from them and give it to yourself, but you're like, gosh, if God, you're so good, then why can't we both have that gift? Or why can't we both have been healed? Or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and sometimes that can lead us to, in a negative sense, to kind of say, well, maybe God doesn't love me as much.
Right. And then then it turns into jealousy.
Or I've done something to deserve this. You know, what did I do? What did I do, God?
And then you think, well, why not me? And it just feels like your heart is breaking. So we understand that there are some of you who are listening who are in that heartbroken state. Maybe it's that somebody else is suffering and you're aware of it and you just can't alleviate it and you so desperately want to. So now by observing this other person's suffering, you begin to call into question God's own goodness and his power and all of these divine qualities that we've been talking about for 8 or so episodes. You know, we've talked so much about God's goodness. These are questions that we all hold and we've held from time to time. Maybe we're holding them right now, and maybe they're confusing us in this very moment. And so let's not sugarcoat what some of us might be going through.
And we're certainly not going to give you a bunch of platitudes today either. You know, I mean, we really want to do this topic justice. This is something I really think that could be talked about over dozens of episodes, and we'll probably come back to it time and time again. Maybe a 30, 40, 45-minute talk is not going to be able to do justice, but we're hoping to bring some insights here that will help people maybe with their own struggling. You know,
and understand what it is that we're dealing with as we live
and how
in
to
this
perceive
world.
it and how to perceive it. You know, so
baby steps, right?
Baby
how
steps.
to make sense of the senseless.
Yeah. Because evil really is used to either discredit God's existence or to demonstrate that God really isn't who he says he is. You know, the argument goes something like this. You know, if God is all-knowing, if he's all-powerful, if he's all good, then he should know evil exists because he knows everything. And he has the power to stop it because he's all-powerful. And he would stop it because he's perfect love. But that's not the case. Evil exists. Suffering exists. So right away, we begin to kind of question God.
How can these two things exist at the same time?
Right.
And how do they exist together?
Yeah. So either God isn't all-knowing and he's ignorant of evil's existence or my suffering, or he's impotent and he's powerless to do anything about it. You know, or worse yet, he knows it exists.
This is the one that gets people.
Right. Because he knows it exists and he can do something about it, but he chooses not to.
Yeah, why not me?
Yeah.
You can, why not me?
And that would make him wicked instead of good. So the problem with that argument is that it's assuming that evil and God are mutually exclusive. You know, meaning that they're not able to coexist at the same time. You know, if God is who he claims to be, evil can't exist. And if evil exists, then God can't be who he claims to be. It's like an either or. There's no they can't coincide together. It's almost like flipping a coin, right? You can't have both a heads and a tail. They're mutually exclusive. Either you're going to get heads or you're going to get tails. And that's not how God and evil work. They can coexist, and that's
they
where
do.
They
That's
do.
our reality.
That's our reality, and it becomes difficult for us to wrap our heads around that. So what we want to do is we want to help listeners to understand that the existence of evil doesn't violate the existence of God or discredit his characteristics in any way. And we really hope to provide a lens through which to view evil and suffering that will lead our listeners to realize not only where God is in the midst of evil and suffering, but also how he is loving us through those situations and times at all times.
Yeah, situations that seem so unloving.
Yeah.
Right? How
Or
is God loving
hopeless.
me when I feel so heartbroken?
And so as we wade into the waters here, it's important that we first make sure that everyone really understands what evil is.
Yeah.
Like when we talk about evil, what is evil?
So let's frame evil first. And it's a question I've asked myself many times. Why is God doing this? When I think about, maybe something that's happened that's causing me suffering, my initial knee-jerk reaction is to say, why is God doing this to me?
Right.
As though he's the direct cause of my suffering or something ridiculous like that. I have to remind myself that God's got nothing to do with it. It's not as though God is directly causing what it is that I'm going through. Evil's not something that God is capable of.
Right.
It goes against his very nature. Evil can present itself in two different ways. It can be physical or it can be moral. So a physical example would be something like an earthquake. Let's take that example.
Right.
There's nothing that I have not committed any sin that will cause an earthquake to happen. But I live in a world where earthquakes occur and it could affect me. It has affected millions of people, right? It's been destructive.
Yeah.
It's contributed to loss of property, loss of life.
Sure.
It's strange because God has created the world to be good and beautiful. And then we have something like a natural disaster and the world that's good it presents itself in such a disordered way.
Right.
And the truth is that because of sin, everything's affected. There's nothing that's untouched by sin, the
Right.
world included. This is how physical evil can present itself.
Right.
Our good world is affected by our own disobedience.
Yeah.
And so it's another relationship that's affected, not just my relationship with another person, my relationship with God, but my relationship to the very world that I exist in, the very earth that I live in, is alienated from God and his goodness, in a sense.
It's, sin.
And it becomes hostile to me.
It does, right. And so we have to remember, the reason why, physical illness, natural disasters, the reason why that's a part of the problem of evil is because, as you just said, sin has consequences. And one of those consequences is it brings disorder into creation.
Yeah.
The fall of Adam and Eve brought sin and disorder and chaos into creation, and now we suffer in the aftermath of that. But that's not how God intended it to be. At the end of time, there's going to be a new heaven and a new earth where everything is restored to order. So again, I think one of the biggest struggles that we have sometimes is dealing with the randomness of these natural events or sometimes these life events.
Yeah, these other physical evils.
Yeah.
You're like, I didn't do anything directly.
Right.
A lot of times I suffer because I have done something, right? And that's a moral evil, and we'll talk about that. These physical evils, why do I have to be affected by something I didn't have anything to do with?
My wife and I, we lost twins back in 2004, while Denise was pregnant. And that's, sometimes we could sit back and we could wonder, why did this happen? Right? What did I do that resulted in, the loss of these twins? Or, why did God allow this to happen? Why did God not do anything about it? And that certainly is. I think it's a legitimate question. I think it's an important question that we have to ask. But it's where we're looking for the answers that can kind of lead us into a deeper understanding and appreciation for God and His love for us, or lead us away depending on how we respond to that. And it's interesting because the doctors had no answers for that. We didn't have any answers for that. There was nothing that we could kind of point to we exposed ourselves to this and we did this and that resulted in, them dying in the womb. There was just no answers, and we were very quick to realize, well, that is part of life. And the doctor kind of told us that your body was doing what it was designed to do. There was something wrong with the pregnancy, and so the body took care of itself and terminated it on its own. That it happens. So finding God in the midst of all that, I'll come back and I'll speak to that later because I think it's good to kind of touch upon that. But that's one of those natural evils. We don't have an answer for that. But I can tell you, and I will tell you a little bit, as we kind of progress through this, where God's hand was in all that, in the aftermath, and how we came to perceive that reality, how God was able to transform that loss into something that has been amazing since then, because that's what God does, and that's what we're leading to.
So the physical evils that we experience, they're things that affect us or the people that we love through no fault of our own.
Yeah.
Because we live in the midst of chaos caused by sin.
But that's very different from moral evil.
Moral evil, exactly.
Yeah.
So moral evil is an act of the will. Something that I intend to do. It's something that is directly willed and committed. Something like murder, something like adultery.
Right. I'm reaching out and grabbing the forbidden fruit for myself.
So when it comes to both of these categories, they're a complete departure from who God is. And it allows us to establish something very important about evil. It's a deprivation of God. So what happens when you deprive God of a situation, physical or moral? What's present? Evil. That's what we mean when we say that when we describe evil as privation. It's a deprivation of God, meaning that it's a situation that's being deprived of God's goodness and love. So if you've ever felt uncomfortable in the presence of sin and evil, I say that's good. It should make us uneasy because we weren't made for it.
Right.
We were made in the image of God. We were made in the likeness of God.
We're made for love. Yeah.
So it's a problem when we become too comfortable with sin. If we don't feel uneasy in the presence of sin, and if we can't sense evil anymore, perhaps we've numbed ourselves to silence our image.
Right.
I would be more concerned if that was
the
situation.
Case, right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to know that when we speak of evil being a deprivation of God, we don't mean that God is absent or excluded in some fashion when evil occurs.
No, that's always it's his goodness.
Right.
It's his love that's not directly present.
Right. Because doing that leads us to that false idea that God and evil are mutually exclusive.
And God's never not somewhere. God never ceases to exist.
Right.
So we're not denying the existence of God.
Right. So God's got nothing to do with the cause of physical or moral evils, but God is very much present in the face of those evils.
So if God's not the source of evil, then why does evil exist? And I would ask that you stick with us because what we're saying may initially sound kind of theologically cliche, but we promise it's not.
No, it's not.
We have to start by saying that God is not the source of evil. He's the source of love. And love necessitates the existence of free will and the choosing of free will. So God creates out of love for love, but in order for love to really be love, one has to have the ability not to love. So think about it. The beauty of a marriage proposal is that one party asks and then the other party accepts. Neither of those things have to happen.
Right.
The guy, because I'm going to go with the traditional image here, doesn't have to ask for the woman's hand, and she doesn't have to say yes. But when he asks and she does, there's much rejoicing.
There's
there are parties, right? We bring the cake out. Everyone's thrilled, right? And your family, your community rejoices with you. It's because they've mutually decided to enter into marriage. That's what makes it so beautiful, because there's been this mutual decision where they've said yes to each other. There's nothing pretty about force, right?
No.
In fact, force or a violation of free will is what would nullify a marriage in the eyes of the church.
Yeah, no shotgun weddings.
And that's... I was going to say that.
Yeah.
The God who is love created us out of love and would never force us to love him back. And so love can only be real love when it's freely chosen.
Yeah,
so it's all
right.
predicated upon the existence of free will and how God loves us in the ability to frankly not love him, which seems like it shouldn't go together, but it does.
It does. They go hand in hand. Yeah, because love is a choice, as is evil, and evil exists because all people share in the ability and the power not to respond in love. You have to realize that, God took incredibly great risk in creating us with free will. Because by giving us that free gift, we're free to look at God and say, I don't want you. I don't want to have anything to do with you. I want this, that, or the other thing for myself. Get out of my way.
But he knew all this. He knew that we would say no. He knew we would reject him.
He knew Adam and Eve were going to fall before he even breathed life into his nostril.
And that we would exercise this free will in a way that he would not have originally ordained.
Right, in a way that abuses the gift that we've been given. But God never stops loving us in spite of that abuse. And God is always trying to use these situations, as we'll see as we go through, we'll use these situations in order to draw us closer to him. He doesn't want us lost to sin, and so he'll even use sin in order to save us, right? I mean,
And he doesn't want us to suffer either.
Right.
God would never directly will our suffering. It was not part of his, if sin had not taken place in the garden, suffering would never have been a part of the equation.
So when we deprive someone of a given circumstance of love, evil is going to be present instead. And so if God is love and evil is a deprivation of love, then evil is it's ultimately a deprivation of God. Suffering exists as a result of evil, whether it be moral or physical. And if God doesn't will evil, then he doesn't will suffering either. Like we just said, hopefully that kind of clears up what evil is. But let's break down evil's actual relationship with God. Okay, right? So we believe that God is all-knowing. But here's the thing. Here's the caveat. As soon as we label God as such, we've limited God's knowledge because we're using these human ideals to define a being who is the origin of everything we know. It's one of those things that kind of makes your head spin a little bit. We also have to understand that our vantage point as human beings is extremely limited, right?
We only see things through the lens of our own experience.
Yeah, perception is the key to reality. So how we perceive things is going to create our own little reality. But even more so, when we look at the state of affairs today, things like violence and hate, indifference, poverty, war, suffering, all of these things that are taking place in the world, we can easily become discouraged or depressed because there's apparently no end in sight, right? Like when is this going to end? We feel hopeless, and we talk about how things seem senseless all the time. The senseless violence, the senseless rage. This is senseless. That's senseless. So keep in mind that you're not alone. Mm-hmm. We all are perceiving things this way. But then there's Adam and Eve.
God told Adam and Eve in Genesis 3:15 that he had a rescue mission planned to redeem the world and to undo the sin and death that their actions brought into the world, right? And then Adam and Eve died without ever seeing this mission come to fruition, as did countless generations after them. Even during the time of Moses, an entire generation of Israelites perished in the desert before reaching the promised land. We hear them grumbling against Moses over the course of their 40-year journey, asking if he brought them out there just to die in the desert. God knows we don't understand necessarily. We don't see things the way that God sees things, but God knows exactly where the road is headed and how this story will end. He understands the great culmination. But we, in our limited view and knowledge and limited lives, are often unable to see the greater good, which is a phrase I use very trepidatiously. Right?
Yeah.
I think it's misused almost every time it's used. But he's able to see the greater, for some reason it makes me a little bit better to just say greater goodness, or the kind of divine-oriented goodness that only God could bring about. Right? Because I would never want to just so simply characterize something as, it's just for the greater good. Right? That does nothing for anybody. So please don't misunderstand us when we use this phrase. But only God is able to see the goodness, that great goodness that he can bring out from sin and suffering and evil, things that he would never have directly desired. And the resurrection is proof that God can use sin, suffering, evil, the ultimate effect of all those things, which is death. He can use it for good and to further his divine will for his mysterious purposes. We're talking about things that are very, very mysterious, that our minds don't really understand, certainly not to the fullest extent. Evil, it still has to be said, even though we don't understand this, evil can never thwart God's divine will. If it could, then evil would be more powerful than God, right? And that's simply not true. And so if that's not true, then what is true? What is true is what Thomas Aquinas tells us, God only allows evil so as to make something better result from it. Right. And that's the kind of greater good that we're using very, very consciously.
So when we talk about God being all-knowing, we don't have to look any further than salvation history, to see our own example of our inability to see this goodness. I mean, the road that Adam and Eve set humanity on looked pretty bleak, pretty hopeless, until God assumed a human nature and redeemed the world through the paschal mystery of his Son. They heard the promise, but they never got to see it fulfilled. A whole generation of Israelites, as you said, that they were led into the promised land. They were led into the desert with the promise of being created as a new nation, a new land. A whole generation never got to see it. God is oftentimes doing something with the suffering and the evil that exists. He is appropriating it in order to further his will. And sometimes we're privileged to see it, and sometimes we're not. And that's where the hope comes in, like we talked about in that last episode. Being a people of hope, I have to hope and I have to pray that even though I might not be graced with the ability or the privilege of being able to see how God is going to redeem this, I have to trust that he is going to do it, right? I have to hope that he is going to do it. I have
and
hope.
that will be perfect. And then sometimes we do get the tiniest glimpse. I think about Simeon in the New Testament, right? He received a promise that he would not die until he looked upon the face of the Messiah. And it's just this little moment in time. He didn't see the passion, the resurrection, the ascension. He didn't witness any of that. But what did he see? He got to hold the child Jesus in his arms for just a moment in Scripture,
and that moment changed his life.
And we still pray his great prayer in the church. My own eyes have seen the salvation, but he actually didn't see the work of redemption actually work out. But he looked upon the face of Christ. So sometimes we won't see it at all come to fruition. Maybe we'll see it indirectly. Maybe we'll just get a glimpse of it. But we trust in the midst of that.
Right. Yeah. We always have to keep in mind that God is God and we're not. We're never going to be able to see the complete picture, how all of this stuff is going to work out, because it might not be for me. It might not be for my family. It might not even be for this generation or the next. It might take like millennia, in order for this to bear the fruit that God desires it to bear. But that's where I stand in hope. God sees the big picture. And so that means that I can be still and put my trust in God, knowing with absolute certainty that God is going to somehow use this evil. He's going to use this suffering to further
He will
his
make
will.
it good.
He's going to redeem it.
In his love.
Yes. Yeah. And this is one of the reasons why during the Easter Vigil, we sing what's known as the Felix Culpa. And that's for everybody who doesn't know what it's called, that is the "Oh Happy Fault of Adam" that's sung in the Exaltet. Oh happy fault of Adam. Geez, look at all the suffering, the death, everything that's going on in the world because of the choice that Adam and Eve made to be disobedient to God. How can that possibly be a happy fault?
Yeah, you might hear it and think, oh, so God wanted this to happen.
Right. No, that's not the case. Adam's sinful act allowed sin and death to enter into God's creation, but it also paved the way for the incarnation and the most potent display of God's infinite love for us. God actually allows evil to exist because he's all-knowing, not in spite of it, because he knows where this evil, where this suffering, where it's going to lead, right? He knows what good he's going to be able to bring from that. So the other thing that we struggle with, besides God's omniscience, his all-knowingness, is his omnipotence, his omnipotence, or as
if you say omnipotent, I quit.
So the other,
we have to have some standards. Come on.
Right. So the omnipotence of God.
There we go.
Right. The omnipotence of God is God's all-powerfulness. And sometimes it's funny because sometimes you hear the argument put out by atheists to refute the existence of God, because they'll argue, well, can God create a rock that he can't lift? Well, the idea being that if we say yes, then he's not all-powerful because he can't lift the rock, and if we say no, then he isn't all-powerful because he can't do it. So it's like
a gotcha moment.
Right, it's a gotcha conundrum. See, I told you. It's a clever little argument, but one that is critically flawed. Being all-powerful doesn't mean that God can do what is logically impossible. We have to remember that the word of God in Greek is called the Logos, and that Greek word means reason and logic.
It's the very mind of God.
Yeah. So God is a logical God. God is a God of reason. This is why faith and reason are critical, two sides of the same coin when it comes to faith. We can't just throw reason out the window when it comes to matter of faith, and nor can we throw faith out the window in light of reason. They go hand in hand because that's who God is. So this argument that's posed by atheists to deny the all-powerful nature of God is just completely illogical.
And look at the amazing ways that God works on us. So one of those quote-unquote greater good situations we mentioned before is when God makes use of suffering and evil to call us back to him.
Right.
Isn't that worth doing. So think of the story of the prodigal son. He sinned against his father. He took his inheritance, essentially wished him dead, said, give me what's mine. And then he squanders it on a life of dissipation, right? Of sin. Only when he found himself destitute, starving, and suffering did he come to his senses and return to the Father. God will use anything and everything at his disposal to bring us to eternal life, to have
not lose us,
share in that with him in
to
eternity.
save us. Yeah.
So even if life is filled with tragedy, pain, and suffering, and that's heartbreak, that can still lead to a change of heart that causes someone to turn back to God and accept his love and his lordship over his life. That's worth experiencing, right? That's the gift that's worth having. And that's God's power at work.
Yeah, that's God's omnipotence or omnipotence, right? I'm not seriously. I mean, but
that's amazing. That's almighty power.
That's where
work.
the power really is. That's where God's power really is. That He can take something seemingly hopeless and seemingly without purpose, and then just bring meaning and life and restoration and healing from it. Use that to save us. That's the real power of God in action. You may feel powerless in the face of the suffering that comes about through betrayal in a marriage or a terminal diagnosis or dealing with the aftermath of a tragedy like an accident or a natural disaster. But God is not. God's true power is displayed in how He can take this evil that we are contending with and transform it.
In a way that only He can.
Yeah, to redeem it, if you will, into something good, which is why God is all good. The idea that He's omnibenevolent. God is all good.
Despite, I want to just say for a moment that you may not feel like that's true, because we can so often be led one way or another for good reason in our feelings and our emotions.
Yeah.
So even if we don't see how that's good, we don't see how God is good, we have to sometimes look at it from the outside. And there are times, and I've heard this said to me, I didn't come up with this, but in times of tremendous grief and suffering, we have to just go with the facts and start to state things that we know to be true. Right. To look out of our emotions for just a minute. Maybe you can just get your head above water for just that amount of time to be able to speak one thing out of that you know is true.
Right.
And that can begin to address that particular state and suffering. Right. That's all you can do.
Yeah. And that might be all that's necessary in order for you to experience this paradigm shift in how you're experiencing all of this. Much like love and hope, which get watered down in our world today, and we've talked about that, in past episodes. So too does this notion of goodness. And so when we talk about the omnibenevolence of God, or when we talk about how God is all good, it can be a struggle for us, as you mentioned, because anything that pleases me can be deemed good, right? That it makes me happy.
It's perceived good, sure.
It's a perceived good. So as long as I'm happy, everything is good. And God's goodness is infinitely more profound than that.
And that's seen most extensively, right, in God's plan in eternity, spent in heaven, right? He's playing the long game all the time when it comes to happiness and goodness, and that's a game that we don't have the discipline to play the game in the same way.
Because our
it's all about
happiness is short-term,
short-term gains, right?
Yeah.
So it's precisely because God is infinitely good that He can transform sin and suffering and evil and even death and bring something good from it.
Going back to the story that I shared earlier about my twins and the loss, it was amazing because after that incident happened, we stopped in chapel, and Denise and I prayed a little bit here in the chapel in the rectory on our way home from the hospital. And again, just asking God to give us the grace to be able to weather this. We had 2 daughters at the time, and both of them were excited about it, and they were young, at that time, 2 or 4 and 3. They were excited. They were looking forward to it. And when we got home, it would have been great if God had been there just to kind of give us that big hug and just assure us that everything was going to be all right. But because that's what we were looking for, that's what we wanted, we quickly realized God's hand in all of the outpouring. I mean, I had people reaching out to me from parishes that I hadn't been in ministry in for like 20 years. So we realized that the tremendous outpouring of support from people, people who we hadn't heard from in years and years, just reaching out to us, that was God loving us through them, and assuring us that he was present there. I mean, we even had friends that had been friends for years. We watched their kids be born and grown up, and they were writing us notes saying like, I've experienced this too. And we had no idea. They never shared it with anyone. And so we recognize God's hand in that. But more importantly, because of faith and because of what I know about who God is, I'm consoled every day of my life knowing that Michael and Gabriel, we named them, Michael and Gabriel, are up in heaven. And they're sitting on the lap of Jesus with all the other children who died far too early and way before their time. And they are praying for me, right? They're praying for me. They're praying for Denise. They're praying for their brothers and their sisters because they know firsthand the glory of what awaits, and they don't want us to miss out. Right? I mean, how beautiful is that? I mean, I have such consolation in that. I know that their prayers are responsible for keeping me close to God and are likely responsible for many, many of the little miracles we've experienced individually and as a family. And I can't begin to tell you how many times I'm just about to grasp that forbidden fruit and something is put directly in my path to make me pause as my hands are ready to pluck it from the tree, right? And giving me the opportunity to let go and to walk away.
Maybe a little
in that
hand
moment. Yeah. It's just a little hand. This is just coming up. It's almost playful sometimes in the way it happens. It's not, again, this is nothing cosmic. It'll be something will happen and like the phone will ring just at that moment, or the doorbell will ring, or there'll be some type of interruption that just kind of comes just at that moment. And it's almost like child play. And again, I just sit back and I think that's them, right? They are working overtime to get their old man into heaven because he ain't going to be able to make it on his own. Had they been born, they may have done some amazing things, but what they're doing now is of eternal significance. And I really find comfort in that.
And that's that long game,
right,
that you're able to understand now.
Right.
And that God welcomes you into that understanding, right?
Yeah.
First thing you did was go to the chapel. It's like, well, how can I understand this? My own mind is not going to make sense of this. So give me your mind to understand it.
Again, we had no answers, and it wasn't like God caused this to happen or willed it to happen. He didn't. That's not what we mean when we talk about God's will. I think that's one of the most challenging things we can hear sometimes when we try to console somebody and we think that we're doing good by saying, well, this was God's will. It's not God's will.
Yeah. Don't say things that you're not sure about. Yeah, if you're tempted to say that, I ask you to pause.
Yeah, it's because that's not God's will. God wills our happiness. How can the loss of a child or the loss of somebody to a drunk driver or a terminal diagnosis, how can that possibly be happy, right? God wills your happiness. And so we have to be very, very careful. I know we're being well-meaning and there's a well-intention behind that.
We can cause people very easily to misunderstand God and to ask more questions than they're already asking. We've already talked about those questions that we just ask because we're human. So I think that can actually contribute to more suffering.
I heard somebody one time try to console somebody who was going through a grieving process, and they did say, it's God's will. He's in heaven and everything. And her response, this woman's response to her when she said that, well, I hope that's not God's will because that's not the God that I believe in. Mm-hmm. Right. And I thought I was edified because sometimes we can take that the wrong way. I mean, she understood where the woman was coming from, but she also knew that she was misspeaking, when we say that. So we do have to exercise caution. But again, like an all-knowing God, right? An all-powerful God, an all-good God took that situation. Oh man, right? And I got my own two little saints in heaven. Yeah. Right, who I know are looking out for me. Would I love to have them on my lap instead of Jesus' lap? Absolutely, but I know that I'm going to get to see them in eternity. And if I get there, I know that they played a big part in that. So this is what we're talking about, right? There was an evil that happened. It was out of our control. It was one of those natural evils. But even moral evils, God can use those and repurpose them for.
Yeah, there's no evil too great that God's like, I don't know what to do with this, or I don't want to do anything with this.
We say that Jesus conquered sin and death once and for all on the cross. And if that's true, then evil cannot have the final say. It does not have the final say. God does. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember.
It's helpful for me when I think about, in times of suffering or when I'm thinking about grief and mourning, I always go to Jesus weeping at the tomb of Lazarus. It's always an image and a story that really resonates with me. And I think that Jesus's sadness is open to interpretation. A lot's been said of it. In one understanding, he's come face to face with this physical manifestation of evil, right? That just death. Death was never intended. And so it's this physical effect of sin. And in some sense, he's mourning the reality of sin, the fact that, this is what sin causes, right? And maybe he's in his justified discontent and anger at the reality of sin, it's caused him to cry. In another understanding, though, he's lost a friend.
Yeah.
And his friend has undergone what was never supposed to have happened. So he's experienced loss in this way, knowing that he's going to raise him from the dead and knowing that, he's going to go on and perform this work of redemption. He's still grappling with death right in front of him. And I think he's also contemplating his own impending death. Just this image of, for whatever reason, whichever understanding, because I think it's both. It's not a one size fits all interpretation. We weep and Jesus weeps.
Yeah.
And so it's not as though he does not know what it is to mourn and to suffer and to cry and to maybe be mystified in his humanity, right? Because it's always that understanding of his humanity and divinity together that we have to work to understand. But as we cry, he has cried. And so he knows what it is that we experience. Yeah. And he knows what it is to have loss. I don't want to say too much about what Jesus's human experience is with his divinity, but what are we told? We're told, and Jesus wept. And so let's not just ignore it. It's something that I think is there certainly for our benefit.
But I think it's a beautiful image, because when I'm suffering or when I'm experiencing some evil in my life and it's bringing me to my knees, and and maybe I'm just having a real good cry because I don't have any of the answers and I'm desperate, I know that God is sitting there next to me, weeping with me. Right? Because he doesn't want me to suffer. Like what loving parent does? Like, I don't want my kids to suffer. Like, I would do anything in order to prevent that, to alleviate that suffering. And God does that. He wants to alleviate that suffering. He doesn't want us to suffer. And I think that's one of the reasons why, in his goodness and in his knowledge and in his power, he's able to take that suffering and transform it. But we have to allow him to do that. We have to invite him in and just say, God, just take this, help me through this.
Right. And trust everything to his timing.
Right.
And then we have to remember what St. Paul says. He says in his letter to the Romans that we know that all things work for good for those who know God and who are called according to his purpose. So that has to be one of the facts that we speak in the midst of suffering.
I hope we did justice to this, as we wrap things up, because evil's existence, suffering that exists in the world, really does actually affirm the existence of an all-knowing and all-powerful and an all-good God. And when we understand that correctly, it really allows us to find meaning in suffering. It might not be for our eyes, it might not be for our time, but our understanding of who God is assures us that there is always meaning and purpose in suffering, because God will always, always, always bring about justice, mercy, and good from the suffering in our lives. It will always lead us to a more profound encounter with his love if we allow it.
And so where do we go from here? What can we do after having said all of these very true things? I would suggest opening up the Psalms. If you take a look at the Bible, I think it's no accident that the book of Psalms is what follows the book of Job. Job is suffering, right? Yeah. And when we're suffering, we're like, let's read about Job's suffering because we want to feel better about our own lives. The Psalms they vividly capture the array of human emotion and any circumstance that this life can throw at you and have you encounter. It's what gives voice to the things that we haven't figured out how to express yet. These hymns mourn with us and they cry with us. Most importantly, though, they pray with us when we don't know what to say
when we don't
in
have
a
the
state
words
of prayer. They will help you welcome God into the depths of the wounds that have been caused by evil and suffering. And God can and will tend to that wound. That is what we absolutely know is true. Even if you don't believe that, maybe if you can't hold that at the moment, maybe if in the future we can't hold it at a particular time, we still know that it's true, and it's still important to speak the truth. The Psalms can remind us that in the midst of the problem of evil, that the Lord is light and salvation.
And that, I think it was St. John Paul II who said that Christ crucifies suffering, and when we talk about that, he crucifies suffering and he makes it holy. Holiness, the word holy simply means to be set aside for a purpose. And so while in much of our lives, when we look at the evil, the randomness of things, when we take a look at the suffering and the tragedies that sometimes we have to endure in life, we're searching for meaning. We're trying to figure out, how to make sense of all this.
Because sin should seem senseless.
It should,
because it is
yeah,
senseless.
It shouldn't make sense. If it starts making sense to us, then
man,
then we find ourselves in a real pickle. But the fact that it doesn't make sense for us and we're searching for meaning, John Paul II tells us that it's in Christ Jesus. Crucifies suffering for us, and he gives it purpose. And so when you suffer, there's an opportunity for me to unite that suffering with Christ, and it becomes redemptive, right? I can use the suffering that I'm experiencing, pain that I'm experiencing, and offering it up. And again, when we're talking about offering up, we're not talking about that idea of suck it up, buttercup, that we all see.
Another overused phrase.
Right. God's not looking for that type of offering up where we just blindly accept it and just, okay. No, we make it redemptive. We take that suffering, uniting it to the suffering of Christ, and then Christ can use our suffering.
The one who knows suffering. Right. He knows suffering.
As an offering of love for the souls in purgatory, as an offering of love for our family members.
Yeah, love that we may never see. Yeah. We may never see how it's all going to work out, but we entrust it to the mind and the will of God.
But imagine
that He is love.
Imagine offering your suffering for the souls in purgatory, and then when God calls you home, standing at the gates of heaven, and this long line of individuals who you are responsible for getting into heaven. Same way like my sons, mm-hmm. Michael and Gabriel, they're working, adamantly to get me and my family into heaven. I firmly believe that. You can do the same thing here on earth for those who are waiting to get into heaven.
And that's how the church works together.
That's the beauty of our faith. That really is the beauty of our faith. And there's a mystery to that, but there's a beauty to that as well. And I can use that suffering for the redemption of people that I love in my life, as an offering of love, for maybe their conversion, maybe they turn away from sin like St. Monica and St. Augustine, or even for myself, if I find myself struggling with sin in my life, I can offer my suffering, my hardships. I can unite that with the suffering of Christ and let Him crucify it. But again, it's a choice, and what we do with that really, really matters. So we hope that this gives you at least a way to approach suffering, to understand suffering, to perceive suffering in such a way that you can really find hope when you're in the midst of the travails of life.
Which is not just a wish, that's expectation. You were going to do the outro.
Yeah, I know. It's just a little heavy-ended.
I know.
It's just like, again.
Should we, you know what? Give me that Bible. We're going to close with a psalm.
Oh, very good.
That's what we're going to do.
Okay.
We'll talk until I find one.
Okay.
Just start. That's,
Which is the Psalm of David? The one where he's...
All of them.
No.
51 is the big one. 51 is like the...
That's what I thought.
One. Yeah.
I thought that was the...
But I'm trying to think, which is the one that is the Lord is my light and my salvation. I think that's 27, is it not? Yes. Ooh,
you are good.
I went to school and everything.
Scripture scholar.
All right. This is Psalm 27. Let's close on this. So the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom should I fear? The Lord is my life's refuge. Of whom should I be afraid? When evildoers come at me and to devour my flesh, these my enemies and foes themselves stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart does not fear. Though war may be waged against me, even then do I trust.
Amen.
Amen.
Well, I mean, if you want to, again, we're certainly going to come back to this from time to time because there's just so much to talk about. It wasn't really it's tough to talk about, and just like I said,
we're just dipping our toes into the water.
Yeah.
Of
If you have questions about this, you want to kind of dive into things a little bit deeper, reach out to us via email at mmlpodcast@outlook.com.
If you have a prayer intention, we would be happy to never
you
bring that up.
Yeah.
But we'd be happy to pray for
if
you
you're in the
and your
midst of
intentions.
suffering and you're just looking for prayers.
We can do that.
We can certainly do that without getting into any type of specifics. We can just pray for you and assure you of our prayers. So feel free to email us at mmlpodcast@outlook.com.
All right. See you next time.
God bless.